Welcome to the Fortean Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all the related high strangeness. I go by Bones, and with us, as always, is the notorious RamX.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. Hope you liked that dramatic intro.
Yeah. We're going to get dramatic today.
We're going to get dramatic because we're going to be talking about the apocalypse. It's something everyone knows a little bit about. We got to talk about. I know you've been doing a lot of historical research on it. And it really comes down to kind of who's selling it, because there's a lot of apocalypse in the market.
Yeah, I think that's what ends up calling us over, is there's a couple of things that Forteans get involved. And I think we'll make this season 4.
Yeah, it makes sense. Season 3 was kind of long.
Yeah, I look at it as season 1 was us saying, okay, UFOs are real. Season 2 was laying out all the options and eliminating some. And season 3 going, okay, what are UFOs? What does this all tell us? And and season 4, I think, will be us taking that knowledge and applying it to all sorts of things.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And what calls us to this subject is more the fact that there's some charlatans involved. There's some hoaxsters. There's a bunch of mythology. There's some clearing up that needs to happen. What really excites me about telling you this today is that this is like my favorite type of podcast, where I get to start with a, what if I told you? And then we get to launch into a bunch of historical research that hopefully will change your perspective on some things. And if you believe in these things, that's fine. And beliefs are beliefs. And we're going to cover some theology today. We're going to cover a lot of history today. But Bones and I both do this the normal scholarly academic way. When we insert some of our opinions, we'll try to make that apparent.
Right.
So what if I told you this Scofield Bible that many of you have never heard of affects your daily life in many ways? It affects your interactions with some people. It affects the geopolitics all around you. Through politics, it ends up having an effect on our economic system. And it's at the heart of a lot of things in the culture wars.
Yeah, for sure.
Today, the apocalypse has become somewhat of a product. There are people trying to sell it in many ways, certainly in our space, like the alternative media space. It's a big winner to talk about the end times. Why is that? There's been some books and movies more recently that were very popular. And leading that charge is the Left Behind series, which ran from about 1995 to 2007. And there were some movies with Kirk Cameron. There was another remake. But these books were wildly popular. They sold 65 million copies worldwide.
And you mentioned Kirk Cameron, so you're basically focusing on American evangelical.
Yes, we'll get there in the Scofield Bible. And I want to talk about some of the theology. I just want to establish the fact that there's a marketplace here.
Okay. There's
a theology, and then there's some people involved who are selling that theology and who are just selling concepts within it. And then we'll look at the historical and theological basis for all that today. And you'll see that there's a bunch of charlatans running around, and you'll be able to use your own discernment that much better in discerning which ones of them are fake and not.
Right.
I mean, there's tours and there's travel that go to Israel. And we'll talk about how this Scofield Bible is at the center of a series of beliefs that have become known as Christian Zionism. And it's a focus on Israel and an end time scenario that, as we'll see today, is really the product of a couple of fringe preachers.
Right. And if I could just put my own personal belief in it, it's also a very easy way to sell something. Hey, the world's going to end. Follow me.
Exactly. And as we'll see, the church kind of pushes back on this idea because this whole concept of the rapture was really considered heretical right around 381 AD. So there's a belief by some in the church that this whole idea is heretical. And so let's get into what the idea is, the big idea. And then I'm going to get into the Scofield Bible and how that really popularized the idea and got it into today. So the big idea here is dispensationalism. Scofield popularized the idea in the US. And dispensationalism splits the timeline of humanity into 7 dispensations or phases. And in each phase, God interacts with humanity differently. So one of the things that's really important to dispensationalist theology is that people take the Bible literally, and they take certain parts of it more literally than others. which would cause us to say, okay, is the Bible a historical document? Where did the original book of Genesis that you're pulling this from? Who wrote that? Like, if you're really taking that part literally, we would want to know all of that, right? But that doesn't really enter into it in this belief system. So the important thing to note here is that mankind is in the sixth dispensation. That sixth dispensation involves God interacting with Gentiles because during the other parts of history, it was the Old Testament God, and then Jesus came, but the Jews didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. So in the sixth phase, Jesus is using the church, he's talking to the Gentiles, and then here comes the important part, and is not really well supported or talked about in the Bible. And that's the idea that these Christians will all be lifted up in a rapture. You've heard this term, right?
Of course, yeah.
So you didn't really know that idea of a rapture came from kind of an oddball preacher in Ireland in the mid-18th century. There were other historical threads, like I mentioned, that would make it seem heretical. But the dispensationalism came from a preacher named John Nelson Darby from Ireland. He did this around 1830. And the important thing to note about Nelson Darby was, first of all, he was an extremist. He was from this extreme outcrop of Christianity called the Plymouth Brethren, like at Plymouth as in pilgrim type Christianity. Right. And then the Plymouth Brethren are not extreme enough for him, so he starts the Exclusive Brethren. So he's an extremist, and then he goes out and he thinks the end times is now. So Nelson Darby was writing this dispensationalism idea for his flock. And he was looking at what was going on around them, and they were having all sorts of problems with England, and they were all having all sorts of problems with the church, and people were starving, and he was trying to give them hope and this idea that, hey, don't worry, you come into church, and God's going to snatch you up, because this is clearly the end of days. He was looking around him in Ireland in 1830 when he comes up with this idea. So that's super important. And then there's some conspiracy theories that try to link John Nelson Darby to the Rothschilds and the Jews. And that'll come up a few times in the historical evidence, which is just not well supported. You know, Israel gets involved later in the story. We'll get there. But in the early parts of dispensationalism and the push towards Christian Zionism, it just wasn't really a big part of it. And there's a verse in the Bible in Genesis that says, you know, he who supports Israel will be blessed by me. He who does not, you know, will be cursed. I'm paraphrasing. So taking that verse literally is central to this theology, because in the end times, in some of the end time stories in the Bible, we'll get into this, but there's multiple, right? Like, there's Revelations, which most people are familiar with, but then there's end time stories in Daniel. There's end times stories in Thessalonians when Paul is talking to the Thessalonians. And that's interesting, right? Because when Paul's talking to the Thessalonians, he's also kind of telling them, hey, this is the end of days. So don't worry, you're going to get snatched up and, you know, you're going to be fine in the end. And then when John the Apostle is writing Revelations, he is also talking to people of that time. He is talking directly to the Romans. And when he's talking about these figures that would sort of be known as the Antichrist, but that word is only used once, maybe, in the Bible. When he's talking about these villains in Revelations or Antichrists, he's talking about actual people of the time. And this is not disputed. I want to introduce a term here that we'll use today, and I'm going to call it everybody consensus. And this is when academics agree with Jewish scholars who also agree with Christian scholars. And there's some things that are not well known about the Bible that all of them agree on. And like one of them is the historical and literal nature of the early works of the Bible. They're pieced together from different folklore. And they're different tribes of Israel, as well as they adopted some things from some of the kingdoms around them. Treating it as a historical document would be, in some parts, unreliable, because some parts of it were very much like the succession of Israel and the story of Israel, and other parts were Israeli folklore. And that is something that there is an everybody consensus about. I'll give you an example. Like Moses is not considered to be one guy, and there is everybody consensus about that. I think that's pretty mind-blowing. If you've been learning about Moses your whole life and you go, wait, what do you mean he's not one guy? And how do you know that? Well, it's because there were other stories that were adopted, that were found to precede, the Old Testament collections, that had stories that were identical. And they said, oh, well, they obviously adopted this story into the Moses story. So it ends up becoming like King Arthur. And that is something that there is everybody consensus about. So trying to treat this as a historical, literal document is tough on its face. But that is what they do. And they say, okay, you have to take this one verse about Israel very seriously because it's very important in the end time story that John tells, which is, Israel has to become ascendant and then rebuild the third temple. And then that will signal Jesus' return. Jesus comes back. And that's when all the Christians will be taken up. And there would begin a 1,000-year reign. And in this 1,000-year reign, Jesus would be ascendant. And the Jews would have another chance to accept Jesus as the Messiah. So I think that's an important trait of Christian Zionism, is that even though it embraces Israel, and you see this play out culturally, you see this play out politically, and this is one of those things that'll maybe help you make sense of it, is that Christian Zionism looks at Israel as necessary and important, but they also look at Jews as having not accepted the Messiah, right? So there's a supremacy issue there. Mm-hmm. That plays out all the time.
I might be jumping ahead, but there's that modern belief, too, when, after World War II, the state of Israel was formed, that was seen as, by evangelicals, as the return, as stated in...
Absolutely. All this came up at that time. Like the Scofield Bible, and this was supposed to be the fulfillment of end times again. Every generation thinks that they're in the end times in this modality. In this theology, it's like, this is it. And this is what drives people to televangelists. This is what drives people to leave their church and go to a different church. And we'll get into that in the historical piece. So yeah, it's not like in Christian Zionism, they're like, Jews are awesome. Some people are like that, but the theology itself is more like, well, we need Israel to be ascendant in order to fulfill our prophecy. And this becomes a problem for people in the church. This becomes a problem for people in Christianity. What we're talking about is often referred to as premillennial dispensationalism. And it's called that because the rapture would happen before this 1,000-year reign of Christ. And the dispensations mark the time. Now, this is in contradiction to covenant theology, which is, I would say, adopted by most major organized Christian churches. And in covenant theology, the idea was that God had one covenant with Israel, and then Jesus came along, and that changed the covenant to be with anyone who would accept Jesus.
Okay.
So the whole concept of end times takes on a different pallor if you believe that instead of the dispensationalist theory, which has Israel had one covenant with God, and then everybody else has another covenant right now with Jesus. And then Israel gets another chance at that in the 1,000 years.
Okay.
So it's very different. The study of Christian end times is often referred to as eschatology. And this eschatology has become far more popular with the rise of the internet and people just talking about the end times all the time, selling the apocalypse, right?
Right.
But end times prophecies shape Christian hope and they shape their worldview. They encourage moral living and perseverance if you're following the life of Christ. But if you think, oh, well, all I have to do is get Israel to a certain point and then get taken up in the rapture, there's not as much motive for you to live your life in the life of Christ and be active in the church, whatever.
Right.
And ongoing differences in the Christian community. Because when we talk about religion, like in our religion episodes, we end up talking a lot about Christianity. But there's a good reason for that, because we live in the West. And when we talk about religion in the whole world, you're talking about more Christians than religiously unaffiliated. Christians make up the majority. If you broke people out into whatever religion you want, and then had one block of people who say that I'm not any religion, Christians would still be the largest group.
Okay.
So when we talk about religion, we're talking a lot about that. And then the second biggest group would be Muslims. So Christians are about 2.3 billion. Muslims would be 2 billion. And Muslims have a similar version of something along this end times prophecies too. But that ends up getting buried in a different direction. Then after Muslims would come religiously unaffiliated people, and that's 1.9 billion, slightly smaller than Muslims. And then after that comes Hindus, which are 1.2, Buddhists go all the way down to 0.3.
Wow.
Other religions make up 0.2, and then Jews make up 0.1% of the people on the planet. And this is actually going to become really important when you go, okay, who's really behind the political push and things like that? Like, who's really is that? And let me give you another factoid. There's only 20 million Jews on the entire planet, and a minority of them live in Israel. So when you do all this blame the Jews stuff, it doesn't really work. You could be mad at Israel and what happens there. That's history. You're only talking about 20 million people. And when you're talking about Christian Zionists, you're talking somewhere between 30 to 50 million people in the U.S. alone.
Yeah.
So only about 10 million Jews would consider themselves to be Zionists, according to polls. You're talking about 5 times that amount of Christian Zionists in the U.S. alone. So
yeah.
If you want to identify this, look at the numbers, right?
Yeah, so you got that many people basically taking a literal interpretation, accepting a literal interpretation of the Bible.
A literal interpretation that involves the ascendancy of Israel.
Right.
So we're talking about how the organized Christian sects tend to divide on the subject as well. There's a few different isms that they use to look at end times. And there's futurism, which means, I think this would be what dispensationalism would most likely fall under, and that's mostly future events. So it's going to happen in the future. It's a literal event, and there's a rapture focus on it. And this is popular with evangelical Protestant groups, mostly non-denominational, and we'll get into why. And then there's preterism, which means that end times events happen mostly in the past, that we're in the 1,000-year reign of Christ now. And this is popular. I've heard this in the Greek Orthodox Church. And then there's historicism, which is that throughout church history, biblical prophecies are fulfilled, end times are fulfilled. And then there's idealism, which is that these are timeless spiritual prophecies, and they happen all the time. And this is becoming a more popular theory with progressives, where it's like the Bible was meant to be a guidebook on how to live your life, and then it tells you what's going to happen after. It all plays out in your lifetime every time. And I've also heard something similar from Lutherans who structure their sermons around this idea of basically every year they take you from the birth of the world to through end times. And that's how it plays out in theirs. So there's wildly different views of end times from different Christian groups. And I think that 1.9 billion, the religiously unaffiliated, I think that they tend to see Christianity as monolithic, and that, as we'll see today, that's just not the case. There's a lot of differences between the church on a lot of different things.
Yeah, for sure. But I always think, when I think end times, when I think apocalypse, fire and brimstone, I'm always thinking about American evangelical churches who take and promote a literal interpretation of the Bible. That's
right.
what I always think of. And they believe that that our reality is basically our world is like a fight of good and evil. Like our earth is is just a battle arena between Jesus and the devil.
And how that plays out, that battle, because I think that could be perceived as a lot of different theologies, but how that plays out as a battle is very different between the different faiths. So,
Yeah.
In a lot of faiths, you're fighting against the devil every day when you're trying to do the right thing.
Right.
And Christianity is there, and God is there to help you do the right thing, and the right thing will lead you to a better life. But the rapture concepts and some of these things end up being more of a revenge fantasy, where it's like you're going to get taken up and everyone that you think is evil is going to go to hell. And you were right all along. And they were right.
Right.
And then this is not really traditional Christianity. So how did it start? Where did it start? I mentioned John Nelson Darby, who originally came up with the idea, but then how does it get into America? That gets into the Scofield Reference Bible.
Right.
Have you heard this name before? Scofield Reference Bible?
I have. It's kind of like a Bible with like guidelines written in in the margins, basically.
It is. That's what was different about the Scofield Bible, is that it included Scofield's footnotes.
Right.
So Cyrus Scofield was a Civil War veteran, a lawyer, and he was a politician from Kansas. His personal history included desertion from the Confederate Army, allegations of corruption, and a brief stint in jail. And there's some good stories about him. He starts as sort of a legal clerk, and then he goes on to say that he's a lawyer in some cases. Then he goes on to claim a doctorate in theology, which he never even had formal theological training.
Okay.
This pattern of lying happens throughout Scofield's life. And he begins as sort of his legal work, and he ends up working his way into a group of radical abolitionists in Kansas. And he's trying to get this guy named Engels into the Senate. And so they set up his opponent, Pomeroy, to take a bribe. And he does. And then they bust him out in front of everybody. And then Engels goes on to win, and he makes Scofield DA.
Oh, my God. I didn't know that.
And Scofield only lasts 6 months because he's taking so many bribes and he's so corrupt. And the one bribe that he takes that I find really hilarious is that Pomeroy comes back to him and bribes Scofield to not persecute him for the bribe that Scofield set him up for.
It's the Wild West.
Yeah, it's pretty sad to see how we think America's corrupt today, and it is. You know, look at Ghislaine Maxwell. But it's pretty bad back then, too.
Yeah.
But Scofield ends up saying that he converts in 1879 after a period of drinking and shady dealings following his dismissal as DA. And he also ditches his family. He's got this wife and kids back in Kansas that he completely abandons. And they sort of don't come up again in the story. Even as he's writing the Scofield Reference Bible.
Right. Yeah, I remember hearing about that hypocrisy. It's kind of can't help but chuckle a little.
So after his conversion, and this is where a lot of the allegations that he was helped by the Israelis or Jewish people at the time come from. But one of their smoking guns that they're using is that Scofield was a part of this Lotus Club in Manhattan, and there was a member by the name of Samuel Untermeyer who's Jewish, and he happened to be on one of the committees that had to approve Scofield's membership. That is your smoking gun.
Oh, really?
Is that one Jewish guy was on the committee?
Right.
Like, there's really not good evidence there. I think it misses the point of how and why this Bible takes off. So Scofield ends up working his way into this group of very powerful evangelicals at the time. They're well known. Brooks is the guy who takes him under his wing, and he's also a fan of Darby's work. So we know who introduced Scofield to dispensationalism. It was Brooks. And that's where Scofield ends up getting a lot of his ideas. And Brooks is well regarded in the evangelical world. And the other guy that Scofield somehow ends up getting in good with is E.L. Moody, from like Moody Bible Institute.
Okay.
You probably, if you were in the church in the 80s or 90s, you definitely heard about the Moody Institute, the Moody Bible Institute. So dispensationalism, we'll get there, but dispensation really takes off, and then it ends up taking over in the 90s and the 2000s, and it ends up playing a part in the Satanic Panic and all this stuff. Scofield writes this Bible, published in 1909, and it includes his footnotes. And up until then, there hadn't really been Bibles published in the U.S. with someone's footnotes on it. So when people picked up this Bible, they just assumed that the footnotes were part of the original Bible.
Okay.
Like they just assumed that it was telling them the truth, and they liked it.
Right.
They really liked it. It included all these charts. And, I listened to a lot of good Christian podcasts on this. And Christian scholars, when you find the honest ones that don't have an agenda behind them, are fantastic. So are Jewish scholars. Like the ones who just really want to get to the truth. They're really good, and no one cares about it more than them.
Right.
So they go way deeper than any conspiracy theorist would, and they genuinely want the truth. So I would suggest looking at those sources. So when it's published in 1909, it's paired with the King James Version, which was more popular at the time. And then later it ends up in the NIV version, the New International Version. And one thing that's notable here is that this is 1909. So this is right in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. Again, people are like, I'm looking for answers. I mean, we talked about this type of nebulous life affecting the people of Germany, which ends up informing Himmler and Hitler. We talked about Blavatsky's theories, which are going off at this time. Crowley and his stuff is going off at the same time. So there's a lot of emphasis on spirituality and radical ideas within spirituality at this time. So people liked it. Long story short, right? Like this Volkish movement, and within dispensationalism, there's a push towards returning to the land. And this really came from Darby. Darby was like, we need to return to the land. And he was telling people to break away from their organized churches. And that was really important because that ends up happening when the Scofield Reference Bible really takes off. People are like, I don't want to listen to your stuff that tells me to go be a good Christian every day. I want to go run up and down the aisles and scream about the rapture.
Right.
So that ends up happening, right? And it starts off this whole new branch of Christianity. Because for the first time, when people are reading Scofield's notes, it really blurred the lines. And it made Scofield's interpretations become authoritative. I mean, less than 10 years before Scofield writes this Bible, he's forging checks with his sister's name on it and leaving his family the entire time. So this is where it's coming from.
It's in that period of time again, you know, at the early 20th century. We see so much kind of develop socially because, you know, when we've talked about it in previous podcasts, the rise of kind of natural sciences. And even art was changing. You know, surrealism was starting to gain ground, and there was a lot of reactions. And it sounds like this was another reaction.
Right. The context of the time is super important because when Scofield's telling people this, he's looking around and saying these are the end of days.
Right.
Crowley was saying the same thing at the same time. This was a very common thing for people to say. It was like I said, the Industrial Revolution, and the economy was not doing well in a lot of parts of the world. This gets into America's DNA. It takes off. People start leaving some of the traditional branches and going out, which was encouraged by Darby in the first place. He said, get away from your organized churches, start your own little dispensationalist offshoots, and get ready for the end of days. So it encourages this prepper mentality.
Okay.
It's like disconnect. And we heard this before too, right? With Himmler and the Volkish movement.
Right.
Everything was about
So
retreat.
was this kind of like a guidebook where it would basically be how to be an easy guide into being a parishioner? Is that what this was? Kind of.
It ends up becoming that in many cases, but not all. I mean, there are people out there, maybe who are listening to this right now, who are devout believers in this, but it ends up being, this is the complaint of the clergy, is that it ends up selling tickets to God.
But it sounds like it was like a guidebook, like, because, I mean, that's another real basic characteristic of American evangelicalism is the fact that they have these real small town churches. Right? And they're kind of anti-establishment in a way, and they can do their own thing, and they're independent, and that's the American spirit that's behind them. And it sounds like this book was kind of a guideline. Hey, do your own thing. Don't worry about the movement on the more organized churches. Just do your own thing.
Absolutely. This book fit into America in several different ways that I think you can miss if you rush to the wrong conclusion. It fit into America's ethos of libertarianism and independence.
Right.
And it also fit into America's concepts of the devil, which are way more realized than a lot of other nations. Right. Because we were founded by Christian pilgrims who had they saw the devil everywhere. Right. The Salem witch trials and things like that. And we'll discuss all that at some point. So for millions, Scofield became the guide to understanding prophecy, future events. And that's really attractive. That's what's sexy, right? That's what you can sell. And it's tough to be on the other side of that, trying to sell, penance.
Right.
So by embedding Christian Zionism in his note and treating the establishment of Israel as a prophetic necessity, he ends up laying the groundwork for a U.S. political stance that would endure into the 21st century and shape some of our policies today.
Yeah.
I mean, we just dropped a bomb on Iran because of some of this. Yeah. So it couldn't be more relevant, right?
Right.
So you're a Fortean, eh? So you're a Fortean, eh? What is a Fortean?
So as you mentioned, some of these things fit into the timeline and help dispensationalism take off too. 1909, Scofield publishes, and then between then and 1948, it's starting to grow. It's just growing, it's getting bigger. And then in 1948, this is the founding of the modern state of Israel. So to dispensationalists at the time, like you point out, it feels like this is it. This is the miracle of prophecy.
Right.
And it becomes even more popular at the time. And then there's the 6-Day War that happens in 67, almost 20 years later. And in this war, Israel captures East Jerusalem, which was also seen as a sign of end times, right?
Ah.
And in the 70s and 80s, there were a bunch of Christian authors that started jumping all over this. And then these ideas of Satan and the rapture and things like that, they start to become more realized all the way in the 1970s and 80s. But these are not ancient Christian secrets.
Right.
These are things people were making up in the 70s and 80s and making a lot of money on and still do today. The Scofield Reference Bible obviously makes its way into the Moody Institute, which is a big Bible college in Dallas. So it really takes off in Baptist and Pentecostal circles. It doesn't take off in any of the other established religions.
Okay.
And it also gives rise to a lot of non-denominational churches.
Right. Which are most mega churches, right? Or that's what you want to call them.
Exactly. The televangelists. And they're much bigger in the South, but they are spread out all over. You can find dispensationalist ideas everywhere. So when the Scofield Bible gets into the Moody Bible Institute, it starts to get everywhere, right? And it becomes part of the clergy, and it becomes a part of what preachers are talking about. So in the 80s and 90s, if you were going to church, which most people were at the time, you were probably hearing about some of this dispensationalist ideas, unless you were a Catholic or Greek Orthodox, or if you were a Protestant,
right,
you were most likely hearing about these ideas. And then a lot of people left the church. There has been a massive decline in religion, and Christianity has been no exception. There's just a lot of people that have left the church or just not going to church anymore, but still claiming what is today called a Christian identity.
Right.
And this Christian identity tends to be more tied to this dispensationalist idea, which is more of a revenge fantasy. So then it gets worked into politics. It's been used by many politicians to manipulate that group, and it constantly gets mixed up in our politics. And let's just skip to it and get it out, because it's mixed up today, right? Dropping the bomb on Iran, that dispensationalism played a part in that. Iraq won. Dispensationalism played a part in that. George Sr. was a dispensationalist as well as George Jr. You know, they're from that Texas dispensationalist mindset. Senator Ted Cruz was on Tucker Carlson the other day, and he was saying, I was taught that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who do not will be cursed. He said this very recently, and that was it. So like in Iraq too, we all know no one found weapons of mass destruction, but George Bush Jr. famously went to his people right after 9/11 and said, what do you got on Iraq?
Right.
2 years prior to that, Bibi Netanyahu was at a hearing in front of Congress saying, if you cause regime change in Iraq, it will have reverberations around the world. So he made it very clear, and he has for a long time, that he wants regime change in Iraq and Iran. Netanyahu, from my point of view, more than any politician in Israeli-U.S. history, is willing to play into this Christian Zionist idea. So when I said the Scofield Bible ends up having effects on big things that can affect you, like it even affects Gaza.
Right.
And people's attitudes towards Gaza and people's attitudes toward the genocide that's happening there. And we're against genocide, just period. I think we made it very clear how we feel about the Holocaust.
It's bad. It's bad.
Yeah, genocide bad. I mean, basically, that's our one Fortean Winds policy. I don't know.
Right.
So the genocide that started is bad, and the genocide that's continuing and has killed 10 times as many people. Like
Yes, mass starvation. It's horrible.
At some point, the conversation of reciprocity went out the window, and it just became genocide on top of genocide. So how people feel about this theology, even if they don't understand where it came from, ends up informing some of that. And the Iraq war connection in 2003, 2004 is just very solid because there was key decision makers in Bush's cabinet that were all dispensationalists. This was well known.
I remember hearing about high-level officers, military officers that held biblical views on being in Iraq. It was creepy.
So when I say this affects your everyday life, if you happen to be in one of those wars or around one of those wars or know someone who is affected by those wars and is part of the 22 veterans a day that commit suicide, these things affect all of that because they were one of the reasons for the war.
Right.
So prophecy ends up moving from fringe culture into mainstream U.S. evangelical culture today. But it's actually on its way out. And the way we know that is through polls. But religious polling is actually very hard because you have to define what do you mean by someone's religion? What do you mean by someone's religious affiliation? Does that mean they go to church? How many times a year do they have to go to church in order to be considered? You have to define all of these things.
Right. If you just go once a year, does that mean you're a practicing Christian?
Exactly. I think people would be shocked if they looked at the difference between Christians who go to church and Christians who don't go to church in terms of how much money they make, in terms of how they vote, in terms of everything. There's a big difference between those two groups that I think, again, would shock mostly the people who are religiously unaffiliated. The religious polls in this case are pretty strong because pastors are pretty honest people and they surveyed pastors about how they feel about this theology. So that ends up being pretty strong as far as figuring out, is this on its way up? Is it on its way down? When did it peak? So it appears to have peaked around 92,000 and it's been on its way out since then. Because I think the last stat that I saw was that pastors under the age of 45, 70% of them were for covenant theology and only 30% were for dispensationalism.
Okay.
And it flips in terms of majority in Protestant circles. And those specific Protestant circles, obviously you can't survey. Again, this is the challenge of religious polling is you can't go survey Catholics in there. That wouldn't be an accurate poll. So you have to figure out, okay, are we going to do non-denominational, etc. But these were pretty solid. So it's basically saying that the new way of thinking in Christianity is dispensationalism is on its way out. It's also a big change in the church. The older generation tends to be more towards this dispensationalist idea, and the newer generation tends to be more toward the covenant theology.
Okay.
But either way, the apocalypse is an evergreen commodity. This idea will never go away. This idea of rapture, and I mean, like, it even harkens back to our pilgrim past. What does the Bible actually say about the end times? Well, like I said, it's actually different depending on which part of the Bible you're looking at. But theologians would say that there's a cohesion to all of them. So what does that say? Basically, all end times Christian prophecies have this beginning and a middle. And then the middle is when the Messiah shows up.
Okay.
Most organized Christian churches take that to mean Jesus Christ showed up right then. And that signaled we're in the end phase.
Okay.
And by the way, since we've talked about people who are saying right now, like Chris Bledsoe, that Jesus is coming back or whatever, I always have the one question. Did he say his name was Jesus? Because that wasn't his name. His name was Yahushua. I think Yahushua would know his own name. So did he say, hey, I'm Jesus, I'm coming back? I just want to throw that out there, that I have that one hang up because it's actually pained me a bunch of times to be calling Yahushua Jesus today. But for clarity, I'm doing it. So after Yahushua made himself known, we know we're in the end phase. And how that plays out, like I said, comes back to your view on preterism, futurism, idealism, that sort of thing. But an important component to dispensationalist philosophy is this idea of an antichrist or multiple antichrists, and they're also usually naming celebrities as the antichrists or politicians, you know, and they're like, that guy's the antichrist, you know.
But it's a needed component. They need
it
that
is
antichrist.
You need a villain, right?
Right.
This is a story and you need a villain. Also, by the way, those dispensationalist charts look definitely occult.
Mm.
The term antichrist might appear, depending on who you're talking to, once in the Bible, and it's in John. And it refers broadly to those who would deny Christ's incarnation. People who are saying, you know, Christ isn't the Messiah. And what he was referring to were people who were already in the church. So he was saying that the Antichrist was going to come from there.
Okay.
So then in Thessalonians, Paul speaks of a man of lawlessness, which we assume is the Antichrist. And this is a man of sin. And it's a powerful figure who opposes God, and he exalts himself. Okay. So he's not showing up and saying, hey, guys, worship the devil. He's saying, hey, worship me. I'm your God. I should be like, what do you care about God for? And he deceives many. And I feel like this gets left out a lot. Is that this was a big part of all of these end times prophecies, is that the Antichrist is going to come from the church, and he's going to deceive the church. He's going to break off a part of the church. He's going to break off. So, you know, if you were looking at it, and some Christians do, they were like, well, that's dispensationalism that's doing that, you know?
Right.
So there's big divisions about this stuff. And then in Revelations, John's describing two beasts, one from the sea, which is interpreted as political power, and that's often linked to the Antichrist. And then one from the earth, which is like the false prophet. And that would be the beast, which we assume symbolizes like oppressive evil powers that oppose God and persecute believers. So this is where that persecution thing really hits home. Now, in Revelations, I really have to hit home that John was talking about events during his time. When he is talking about the whore of Babylon, he is talking about Rome. This is not disputed. This is everybody consensus. He is talking about Rome. But the characteristics that we draw from that is that the Antichrist would be deceptive and blasphemous, that he would oppose God or Christ, leads more of an apostate movement, and he would persecute the faithful. That is part of the prophecy. And he's often associated with miracles or signs of the time. So, you know.
Oh, okay.
So people are doing it today, right? They're like, look, the drones are showing up. They're pointing to people exactly. And they're like, this guy is deceiving the church, etc. Like,
yeah, there's always that persecution complex. I think it's a tool also, you know, in American churches to gain followers. You know, we're in dire straits. You know, we're being, you know, they're treading on us, and follow me and I'll show you the way out of this.
Yeah. And the con artists tap into that. So
yeah,
I'm not saying everyone who believes in dispensationalism is a con artist, but there's a lot of them in that movement because of the nature of the movement, that it's a charismatic movement.
Right.
So they can take advantage of people's emotions. They take advantage of people's beliefs. They target people who don't have a lot of information or have access to some sort of Bible study.
Yeah. And that's how they sell kind of the idea of having just hidden knowledge too, right?
Exactly. So depending on how you view theology is how you would also view the Antichrist. And a futurist would view this as an actual individual, a world leader who appears before Christ's return and would be linked to a revived Roman Empire or global government.
Right.
You can see why people would say that.
Yeah.
I don't think you're crazy. It's just that this always happens. Like if you look at John, and I have a good friend who's a pastor of a pretty big church, and he tells me his philosophy is this just keeps happening. It's the same cycle. And this really reminds me of the Hindu philosophy, which we can actually work the Hindus' version of the apocalypse in here. And that's that it's basically in cycles, right? It's just
right.
always
It's more cyclical.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So it happens, but it's rebirth, and it's happened multiple times.
Yes. And it will happen again.
Right.
This actually aligns with our Fortean research, what we found through our years of Fortean research, that this is somehow how the universe maybe works, right?
Mm-hmm.
To a preterist who saw this happening in the past, the Antichrist was primarily the Roman emperor. As I mentioned, that's the literal translation of it.
Okay.
If you don't say John was recording this as a metaphor, which would teach me something about my times, then you take it as a literal translation and you go, the Antichrist was the Roman emperor.
Right.
And a historicist would look at the Antichrist as a succession of figures or institutions that oppose Christ throughout history, and they're often identified with the papacy or corrupt religious power. So, like, you know, there's a lot of rumors about the popes and antichrists floating around all the time. So yeah. Protestants aren't the only one with wild beliefs about end times.
Right.
But as an idealist who takes religion as more symbolic roadmap, you'd look at the Antichrist as a spirit of opposition to Christ. So someone who opposes Christ's central teachings. Hitler, Himmler, antichrists.
Right.
Crowley, who was wearing that Antichrist mantle proudly. Antichrist.
Yeah.
I could really see this definition. In an idealist point of view, this keeps happening. Kind of similar to a historicist point of view, where it just keeps happening.
Right.
And if we look at history, they'd be right. There's precedent.
Yeah.
But the idea of the rapture is certainly helped along by pop culture and movies because it's sexy.
Yeah. I mean, isn't there even criticism on the book of Revelations because it was kind of added later on in the timeline? There's a lot of skepticism about why Revelations was even added to the Bible.
It's a good question. I mean, that's written by John the Apostle, not John the Baptist. So
right.
There's even good questions about why you were including Paul the Apostle's works.
Right.
You know, the disciples obviously make sense, but there's good questions. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, you can't. No one wants to think about politics, but there was a political situation in biblical times, obviously, with the Romans and even John the Baptist and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
Where Dead Sea Scrolls put John the Baptist in more of like a kind of anti-establishment figure.
Right. So I think from a pastoral point of view, if you feel like taking advice from a heretic, is that the end times encourages faithfulness. It encourages vigilance. And it calls believers to be discerning. It calls them to hold fast to Yahushua's central message.
Right.
And it also tells you the end of the story. That's the best part. It provides hope that evil will be overcome through Yahushua's return. And how you view these things will end up determining how you live your life as a Christian. Speaking of contemporary events, let's look at Moses Mike Johnson. He likes to call himself, right? Well-known dispensationalist.
Yes.
Just recently visiting Israel, looking at these red heifers, which they're now trying to clone into red heifers that have no white hairs on them so that they can get this end times thing going.
Are you serious?
Yep.
Oh my God. Wow.
And then let's look at what Moses Mike Johnson did right before the recess, which was to end the session early so that he could get out of a vote on the Epstein files.
Yeah.
So if you were looking at this from a different point of view than a dispensationalist, this was a number of the beast moment.
Mm.
You clearly knew this was evil. It really reminds me of what the other side told me, which is everyone's ideas of good and evil are different. You're wrong.
Right.
And I didn't believe that, right? Because it's like if someone like Mike Johnson really believed in the Bible, wouldn't he be after these people from the Epstein files? Would he ever let Ghislaine Maxwell out on work release?
Yeah.
Like,
it's hard to say. It's
if you thought if you thought the sky was going to crack open tomorrow, right?
Right.
If you thought trumpets were blaring, would you be like, yeah, okay, let's try to get this guy out of trafficking charge?
Right. Yeah, I don't know how it's justified. I mean, maybe because the big picture in their heads is that they have to keep, they're doing God's work and they have to I'm sure they have a name for it, but they have to brush it aside to keep the agenda going.
This idea of Christian Zionism starts to replace morality.
Yeah.
It's like, as long as you're promoting Israel and getting the 5 red heifers, you don't have to promote justice. You don't have to protect children. Like, what is wrong with you, man?
Yeah.
If you hear trumpets blaring tomorrow, don't be surprised if 2 heretics shuffle by you and you're going to hear St. Peter go, "RamX and Bones in the house. I see you down there rebuking.
Yeah.
You know, maybe not all that glitters is gold."
Right. Yeah, it's a strange turn of events. We're kind of in a reset almost when it comes to morality, basically a discussion of morality in America. But we talked about remember when QAnon came up? We were talking about the Epstein stuff, because there's just kind of a link to that too, right? Because weren't they really big into like the idea of hidden knowledge, where they were finding meaning in anything they saw on the internet, even like certain numbers that were typed on a tweet.
You bring up a good point. This is gamification, and that's what Scofield did. He created the charts and he let people do that. And then, by the way, other people have come up with different phases of dispensations. There's like, some people have 9, some people have 11. So if this was anywhere close to anything theologically sound, they wouldn't do that. Right.
But it kind of leads to the conspiracy mindset that we see today. I mean,
it does. It plays in very well. And we know, our audience is into it. And there's a big crossover of eschatology and ufology. End times and UFOs are like hot right now, right? And people are trying to back it in and say, oh, it's the Nephilim from the Book of Enoch who actually took the Anunnaki, and they love this stuff, right? Yeah, it's the same idea. It's this progression of a dispensationalist mindset. And Greer plays into this too. And they know who they're playing into. They know what you already believe, right?
Right.
And they go, okay, how can I spin it? And then they spin it one way, and they look at their numbers, and they go, oh, I see where it dropped off. Let me next time try this. I mean, this is how these people are playing you. This is how the influencers are playing you, too. What they do is they go, okay, I need to make a video today. Look at Superman and Sydney Sweeney, right?
So, okay.
These 2 nothing burgers, no one was that mad about any of that, right? And how that happens is that the influencers get up every morning and they look at what's trending in hashtags on YouTube, what's trending on Twitter, what's trending on TikTok. And then they make videos about that. So if you're a political influencer and you see Superman is hot and it's #1 Google thing, you go, I got to make a video about Superman. How can I make something up about Superman? And then they just manufacture rage. And people did the same thing with Sydney Sweeney. So what? I don't care if she has genes. Right. I don't care that Superman is Superman. It doesn't matter to me. This is completely manufactured rage. And they know who they're talking to.
Yeah, it's just the difference is the reach and the amount of information is just so astronomical. I mean, because I think about before the internet, who was doing that kind of stuff before the internet? It was people in rural areas with shortwave radios broadcasting, building antennas in their backyards and broadcasting the end times from a farm.
No, and before that, it was pamphlets.
Yeah, right.
And you have to trace it that far. And, there's been a lot of truth that's been told through those mediums, right? I'd like to believe that we're one of those, right? But if you use the internet as an example, it's also now become the father of lies, right? To bring it all home. Now I'm adding to the eschatology. Oh gosh, let's get out of here.
Right. Yeah, we should maybe start preaching about touching on the end times a little bit.
Our numbers are going to go up,
Right. Wait, there might be some meaning into this.
Well, I hope that information made you look at things differently. And you're going to process this for a while. And I would encourage you to do it with emerging data. Go, okay, who's doing what? And does this dispensationalist mindset play into that.
Right.
And you'll start to look at how some of that information warfare is conducted, how the mysterious they have enveloped Christianity in that too. And you know what? I think we're going to do an episode in the near future on who the mysterious they are in all of this, right?
Yeah.
I think we have some good ideas on that.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, it really does. I mean, when you look at the whole picture, it's really kind of amazing, the history of it and where we are today. Like I mentioned the internet, but it's not just the internet. It's just kind of amazing. You got a lot of online conspiracies that are just out of control. Politics just enter every facet of our lives, and it really kind of comes back to this. This was the foundation. This dispensation. Yeah, it's just amazing. I'm going to try to say it. Let me try to say it for our listeners. Dispensationalism. Yeah, I got it. Good.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
It did. It laid the groundwork for the type of paranoia that would come to color a lot of our politics and culture wars, etc.
Yeah, for sure. That was good stuff. I have a feeling we're going to touch on this topic again. And we are in season 4, so man, anything goes, right?
Yeah. This is kind of anything goes. We're gonna name who's at the top of all of the conspiracies all the time.
Right.
That's the goal of season 4.
There you go.
And maybe by the end we'll figure out what a Fortean is.
To fort.
To fort.
All right, everyone. Well, hey, thanks for listening once again. Please visit our website at forteanwinds.com. Thanks, Ram.
Thanks, y'all.